Hey there, loyal listeners. Welcome to another episode of the Arkham Sessions. My name is Brian Ward. With me, as always, is the psychologist to the superheroes, superheroines, and supervillains of Gotham City and beyond, Dr. Drea Letterman. Hello, Drea.
Hi, Brian. It's good to be here with you.
Thanks. It's good to be here with you, too. This is a very special episode of the Arkham Sessions. We are not covering Doom Patrol this time. We are releasing this episode to the public on Juneteenth. So we thought we would do something special and cover something that is actually in our poll on Patreon for things that we could cover an entire series of. Doesn't look like that one's going to win necessarily right now, with only 2 days left in voting. But that is the pilot episode of Watchmen, because we thought Watchmen was incredibly important to cover right now, even more so than we did when we put it up as a poll possibility 3 months ago. How things have changed in 3 months.
So, Brian, you often bring in a lot of the background to some of the things we talk about. I know you love history. You've studied history for all of your life. Can you talk more about Juneteenth?
Oh, yes. Yeah. So Juneteenth is June 19th every year. It is the date in which General Granger came into town in Galveston, Texas, and announced to the town, along with his federal troops, that slavery was abolished. And this was the last place in which that was done. So 2.5 years prior, in September of 1862, there was the Emancipation Proclamation by Lincoln that was directly aimed at the rebellion states. And any place that the Union Army took over, they then freed those slaves. And it basically announced that if slaves were to escape from the Confederacy and go into the North, they were automatically free. Obviously you can't enforce this if the state doesn't recognize it. But if the Union Army was taking over areas and regions, they were then freeing those slaves and letting them go. And then right after April of 1865, which is when Robert E. Lee officially surrendered to Ulysses S. Grant at the Appomattox Courthouse in Virginia, and the war ended, Granger and his Union troops came into Texas and said, hey, time of slavery is over.
Right, like
these
moving
are all free people.
Moving forward, you are in an illegal action if you maintain your slave plantations.
It's not, yeah, basically. I mean, the Army's presence being there made it an immediate thing. I mean, they were there to enforce it. So,
right.
So June 19th every year is considered Juneteenth because of this historic day.
And Brian, we know that this is not an overnight liberation. We know that following this, what is a monumental day, what is a monumental ending to the Civil War, is then years and years of continued strain on the Black identities in America.
Oh,
so it's almost this dilemma to think about this date as a singular moment, because we know it continues to extend into segregation and Jim Crow and incarceration of Black folks in America through the 90s, 2000s, and really manifests
even
today
now,
in various ways.
Yeah.
So it's
a lot of the
almost,
people who are arguing about a lot of those people who are arguing about like the destruction of Confederate monuments and things like that. If you really go back and look, you'll find that most of those Confederate monuments were paid for by the Daughters of the Confederacy and were all part of Jim Crow.
It happened much later.
Much later, and they're cheap. They're super cheap. Like if you go online and you see one of these monuments being pulled down, you will find that it collapses like cheese. It is such a cheap manufactured symbol of your history that And when you look at how many existed prior to Jim Crow, and then you see how many were paid for and put up later, slavery
really,
didn't end in 1865.
It's really kind of continuing to build the facade and to build the narrative of principles around this racist country in many ways, or at least in those foundations, that the beneficiaries of slavery and then segregation needed this narrative to be not just perpetuated, but believed in and supported through politics, through government. And it sounds
through
like
education.
It worked.
Yeah, oh, for sure. I mean, the Daughters of the Confederacy have such a hand in really how a lot of people learned in the South. I mean, what a lot of people don't realize is that a lot of textbooks were paid for by the Daughters of the Confederacy. So a lot of the history that is taught in Southern schools is told from the perspective of the South, and it's not by accident. So
this date is important, not simply because it recognizes the end of slavery, but because it begins this, it sort of extends this perpetuation and narrative of inequality. It's sort of an interesting duality of something to celebrate and also something to really dislike and discourage, from at least from my perspective.
100%. So, Drea, are you excited about talking about Watchmen's pilot for Juneteenth?
Well, I'll say a couple of things. One is that Watchmen was released in 2019. I can't remember exactly when, but we watched this certainly with the perspective that it was that it took a racial lens. That this was a show about that certainly had a history in comics and that had just a profound following as not only the narrative, but kind of a genre, its own genre almost. And the show, I think, really dialed up issues around social injustice and policing communities. And it really took a direct, very, what I would call a very straightforward tone about inequality and about safety in communities. Now, today we will talk about Tulsa, which is the setting for the show, and certainly has real history that will apply. The other thing I wanted to say is that, we set out to ask our listeners on Patreon to vote for the next series we would cover, the next series we would dissect and explore from a lens of psychology. And I was kind of surprised that Watchmen was not identified as at least like the top two.
Yeah.
So when you ask me if I'm excited, like the short answer is, I think that this is very timely. I think it would be good for us, you and me in particular, but also, maybe our listeners, to explore some of these themes. As it is often the case on our show, we start with a fictional narrative. We start with something that isn't real. We start with something that we usually care about in terms of fandom or a particular curiosity about something that's been written or created, and then we move into how the story applies to our lived experiences and our psychology. So this, I think, is an opportunity for us to have an honest conversation about a story that you and I both liked very much, but that brings up a pretty profound and very relevant social issues.
I was impressed that this was a story very well told by Damon Lindelof, a white showrunner. Like this was his look at what, when you look at the history of Watchmen, Alan Moore wrote Watchmen to basically be the story of the Cold War. And it was very much of the time that it was written. And you don't have that same story anymore. So to do a reboot or a sequel story to the original Watchmen, but maintaining the civil or the Cold War aspect, doesn't make a whole lot of sense. So Damon Lindelof looked at the needs of society today and said, well, if we were going to do the Watchmen today, what would it be? It would be this racial injustice. And so we're going to do an entire series on this. And I applaud him for thinking of it and having the guts to do it, especially starting the episode the way that it does. I mean, just in your face. We would just flat out say it starts out on May 31st, 1921 in Tulsa, Oklahoma during the Black Wall Street Massacre. And for what was really interesting is the fact that at the time that this episode was released, and because it deals with an alternate universe set forth by Alan Moore in the original Watchmen comics, people didn't know if this was a real thing.
I remember there was a spike in Google searches for,
I can imagine,
for this event. Folks were talking about it. As you're reflecting on the show, I'm also wondering if whether this is a missed window. You know, if this had been a year later, if this show were released, you know, this summer, this month, let's say, I think the response would have been different. I feel like if folks have not seen this show, or even if you've seen it, return to it, because some of the reflections you might be having now are explored there, perhaps are present there, perhaps some of your experiences are validated there. I know that watching it again in the context of what we're experiencing now is different than when I first watched it. But you're right, many people did not know about this history. It is not something, you know, like many events that highlight the experiences of Black Americans. This one was really not prevalent in education, in the educational system. So it is one that I think a lot of folks are learning about. And from what I have read about it, it is cited as the most violent event when it comes to racial injustice, when it comes to a targeted community in our history. And so it is surprising that you know, going back to why we even do the show, a show about comic books opened people's eyes to a very real and an almost forgotten event that happened 100 years ago.
Right. Yeah. I mean, that's the weird thing is it really illustrates that in 100 years, things haven't changed nearly as much as we wanted them to. Like, were you as taken aback to find out that it was a real thing?
I think I had a very, I would call it a superficial understanding that there was this targeted community, this racial violence. And I have to admit that it sort of blended with other events. What I did not know about it was what I recently read about, which is the deputizing of the town folks, like sort of getting community members to participate in this event as if it were planned, as if it were organized.
Yeah.
So those are areas that, you know, were newer for me.
To some degree, it was organized and planned. I mean, it wasn't a spontaneous. It was in response to a couple of things that had happened over the course of that day or the day before.
So I would have to say that the specific details are ones that I'm unaware of. I'm sort of thinking about it in the larger narrative of continued oppression. This is a neighborhood that was fairly well off. This was a neighborhood that was identified as being a target potentially could destroy the morale and the advancement of the Black community. That's my understanding of this event.
Yeah, the area that you're talking about is Black Wall Street. It's the wealthiest neighborhood of African Americans in the country at the time, and it was, if anything, it was a flag of what could be if we allowed African Americans to prosper, and ultimately Oklahomans weren't having it. But
fascinating because the American values are all really centered around individualism, this idea of self-efficacy and self-reliance, and this idea of capitalism. And you see an example of where a community flourishes and represents some of those ideas and is destroyed.
Yeah. I mean, I will say that the massacre itself was not because this community was flourishing, although I'm sure that the community, the white community, wasn't happy about that. They like the idea of you pulling yourself up by your bootstraps unless it's an illustration of how they kept you down to begin with. Sure. The massacre itself started, as many things today do, with this sort of racial injustice. It was a young boy by the name of Dick Rowland who had been arrested on May 31st because the day before, he was a shoeshine boy who was on his way to a bathroom. Obviously, it was segregated. And he got into an elevator that was being operated by a young white girl. And he tripped. By all accounts, most accounts anyway, he tripped, he fell, he grabbed the closest thing he could, as any of us would to stabilize himself, and it happened to be this white girl's arm. And she screamed. And another woman in the building saw it happen, heard the scream, and described to the police that he had assaulted her. He was arrested. He was taken to a courthouse, and white people got word of this, and they basically came to the courthouse in sort of a mob, in a furious mob, that this black boy had assaulted this white girl, and that caused rumors that spread throughout the community that the white mob had lynched the boy. They had not. That sent the black community into a rage. They went to the courthouse. Many of them were armed, and a lot of people were hurt or died during this initial engagement. And, I think like 10 white people died, a couple of black people died. And then as retaliation, the whites targeted this area of 35 city blocks, and over the course of that day and night and into the next day, just razed it to the ground. I mean, it was, and the reports are conflicting as to how many people were injured and or killed. I think the highest report that I had ever read was somewhere in the realm of like 300, 250 to 300 people. I think it's sort of understood that it was over 100 people. Initial reports, or at least initial calculations of some of the totals, had it down to as few as like 30 people, or 35 people. And it was mixed between, black and white,
sure,
obviously most of them being African-American. But yeah, over this 16-hour period of time, they had taken this prominent area of town and destroyed it. And we're talking about people who, obviously, as we see in the show, KKK members, other people who are from town, some of whom have been deputized to do this.
I think, there's, my understanding is that there was little mitigation, little control. It wasn't as if as soon as the uprising occurred or as soon as the attacks occurred, there was a response from from the local government, or it seemed very clear that this was they were going to let this play out.
Yeah. I mean, we're talking about, you mentioned the fact they had airplanes.
Yeah, I noticed. So on the show, I was sort of surprised to see small airplanes dive through and
firebomb.
Yeah, it was like a war. It is like you're watching a war.
What if I told you, I'm sure you have no problem believing in this, but what if I told you that those airplanes were privately owned?
No, I would believe that.
People just got into their airplanes. Your airplane.
I mean, that's no different than today's version of this, from what I'm seeing. Get in your truck, drive to the event or to the riot, and get your arrows and your guns and the things that we're seeing.
Or drive through the event.
Sure. Yeah. It would not shock me for you to say that. People were taking things into their own hands, but again, I say there was an acceptance that this would be what it is. There seemed to be not even a complicit level of understanding, but almost an encouragement for this to occur by the officials. That's the way I understand this event.
Yeah. And here's the really shocking part to me, especially thinking about where we are now, today. What would shock you perhaps is what happened to Dick Rowland after the event.
I'm not sure anything is going to shock me today.
Charges were dropped. I mean, the girl decided not to press charges, and he was let go. He was set free. So what is weird is I almost look at that as more progress than, today. I'm not sure he would have been set free.
Well, and I have to balance that, knowing that there are dozens of documented events where that's not the case.
Yeah.
But you're right. That does actually surprise me.
Yeah. Yeah. He was let go. He moved out of town, and, he just didn't, after your arrest and the rumors of what you did or what other people did to you spark.
It's because she dropped the charges. I imagine that's really.
Yeah, I would imagine. Yeah.
That's at least one of the factors.
Yeah.
So one thing that I noticed about, I appreciate the details, Brian. One thing that I noticed about its representation on the show is that we're really seeing it through this young boy's perspective, that the show centers around the story of this young black child. I don't know, he might be 5 years old. He's quite little. He's shown in a theater. He's watching this this film. Now, I remember when we first saw this, you were talking about that film.
Not this one specifically, because this film doesn't. It's
not real.
It's not real, but it is definitely a facsimile of a classic Western that would have been, a black and white silent film where this Western character who's in a hood and in a black hood, as opposed to like a white robe and hood. He's in a black robe and hood, is chasing down a bad guy, and takes him. And if I remember correctly, the bad guy is like law enforcement. He's like, he's the town sheriff or something, who has been actually a bad guy. And when the robed man, unhoods himself, or dishoods, whatever. I'm glad I don't know I don't know what that is. When he takes his hood off, he turns out he's an African American man who is a marshal. He is a federal marshal. Like he is a higher up police. He is not a vigilante. He's a policeman, and he's
known.
Yes.
The townsfolk say, "Oh, it's the marshal." It's such an and there I think is where you're clued in that this is an alternate universe. This is and I will say this sets up as a racial universe. It's not as if there's color blindness by any means. It is not post-racial. It is clearly strained and has shows a universe that is in conflict based on some recognizable racial tensions, but has some different historical identity related changes that sort of are markers for you recognizing that, like, okay, this is a different, the Tulsa event is the same, but some of these other cues and markers have changed in terms of the sociopolitical landscape. You were mentioning the president. So in this, from the original Watchmen, Nixon was president for a longer period. Here, Redford, like the actual Robert Redford is president.
Well, it's sort of a counter to Ronald Reagan. Ronald Reagan was an actor who then became a politician and was elected president. And so the idea is that the conservative did not become president. The insane liberal became president. So Robert Redford is the president and has been for quite some time. So obviously the 8-year limitation on presidencies didn't just end with Nixon's reign. It ended, period. So now Robert Redford has been in power for quite some time, and he is doing that liberal thing of giving reparations to people, but it's not to the black community, it's to the police community. Because we find out that over the course of one night called the White Night, I think it was 40 police officers were targeted. And there were attempted assassinations. One of those officers is our main character, our hero of the show, who after that night retired because she was shot in her home, but survived. And now those officers and their families have been given reparations, and the people who are against those reparations refer to them as referdations, similar to Obamacare, and just always attach the name of the person you don't like to it, and so now the police force are always masked, so that they cannot be identified and their families cannot be harmed. It is now a safety issue.
I really sort of became more and more curious in this viewing. So in watching this again, when it relates to the police force, because here, police officers, well, two things. They cover their face, so they wear masks, usually some kind of cloth. I mean, all sorts of like really interesting triggers right now. All of us are wearing masks when we're in public. So it's just a very like recognizable yet jarring thing to see. And many of their masks are not dissimilar to the kinds of things we're wearing. When these individuals go into public, when they're on duty, they cover their faces with this kind of from the nose down.
I'm trying to remember who it was, and it's a bright yellow. You can certainly, and that's the police folks.
Most of the cops have this bright yellow, almost a signal that they're.
It's almost like a dicky that's been raised up above their nose. It comes from below their shirt. It's not like something that's visible. It's almost like a part of their uniform that's below their collar and raises above their nose to cover everything but their eyes. And I'm trying to remember who it was, but one of our friends, when this pandemic had first started, and it may have been Mark Bernardin, had one of those. and was wearing it.
Like from the from the Watchmen?
Yeah, like, a bright yellow.
That's interesting.
But I mean, like,
you mean like
someone we know.
they had these available, like you can get these, or maybe it was some kind of giveaway.
Yeah, it may have been a giveaway, or I imagine it's not that difficult to find like yellow fabric that you could make your own with. But someone we knew posted a picture of themselves going out into public, and they had one that it was just like this from the show.
And the second thing that I noticed is that cops can't access their guns. They have to essentially get permission. There's this lock feature. And it's in their vehicle. So we see an interaction, a cop pulls a car over, talks to the white driver. This cop happens to be black. He goes back to his cop car, calls in to the station, I guess. He calls in and he goes through a series of questions. It's essentially an assessment to release his firearm. And he says, requesting firearm lock release. I noticed that not only does he have to request this lock to release his gun, but he also has to demonstrate necessity. He has to demonstrate that his life essentially is threatened. And the questions have to do with, does the perpetrator have a weapon? Are they under the influence? Are there drugs involved? All sorts of things. It's a 2-minute process. And even when he's approved or when the situation is deemed appropriate for him to have his gun, there is a faulty latch. Like it doesn't get released after the first after the first try. So there are a couple of failed attempts.
Right.
By the time he gets his gun, he is shot in the chest multiple times.
Yeah.
By the driver of this vehicle,
who is presumably just transporting lettuce. He's transporting produce in the back of his truck, but really there's something nefarious going on.
He has one of these masks. He has one of these Rorschach masks, which we later learn is what this white supremacist group wears to make themselves anonymous, to identify themselves as a part of this. I will, maybe this is for another time, but I know that Rorschach as a character was an anarchist, was destructive, was a disruptor. That is how I would describe him.
Yes.
I was a little, I don't know, kind of maybe disappointed that his image and his identity, that something about that character was
misinterpreted.
Well, sort of like accommodated to make this white supremacist group. That was jarring to see how that was like reinterpreted.
100%, but factually, wouldn't that be the case? Wouldn't that sort of libertarian the anti-government who got a hold of this journal and published it, and in this journal it reveals Adrian Veidt's scheme to create a squid-like creature that is going to kill millions of people and end the doomsday clock. When you find that out and you become a conspiracy theorist, because the interesting thing is at the end of the Watchmen book, we are meant to believe that Veidt couldn't escape simply by having Manhattan kill Rorschach. Like the news was still going to get out. And now we learn 35 years later that news got out, but a significant part of the population doesn't even believe it. They believe it's a conspiracy theory. And they believe that that Rorschach was crazy or some sort of anarchist who was trying to fuel revolution. And then of course those people are on the fringes, those people who quote unquote feel disenfranchised and, you know, those rebellious
that's
folks.
the identity they band around and want to claim.
Yeah.
And yet they almost rebrand it to be oppressive, which is not something that I associate with Rorschach.
Yeah.
I associate him with liberation, not with oppression. But I appreciate what you're saying, because what you get from the show is that it's not always what it seems. Like this is really kind of the fundamental story that I think really threads through these episodes, is that you kind of think you know, but not everything is as it seems.
Yeah.
And so this you start out aligning with the police force, realizing that their safety is in jeopardy, that they feel unsafe. Like that's their narrative. They don't have access to their weapons. They feel disenfranchised. They feel that they need to defend themselves better. And then you have these, what I call like specialty forces, which is
the vigilantes.
The vigilantes who are in allyship with the police force, and their masks are, I mean, I'd rather be one of these folks in the sense that they get to kind of identify with a superhero figure. They have all these special names, and they're little bit more known.
Yeah, Angela, our lead character, Angela Abar, she is known as Sister Night. She is wearing all black. She has this hooded cloak. She wears the same mask that the police do, only hers is solid black. And then she's got black paint across her eyes to just further make her, you know, the epitome of black, you know, similar to this is Spinal Tap. How much more black can you get? And the answer is none more black. Like she is head to toe dressed.
Well, she occasionally has that white
the white collar
to let us know that there's this kind of
nun-like quality.
Yeah. And that being a subversive version, of course, of what you associate a nun to be. She's in fact pretty brutal. She is called in to interrogate and to use force, physical force and violence to really seek out members of this white supremacist group. I'm blinking on the name, the 7th Cavalry. Is it the 7th Cavalry? 7th Cavalry. So the show really kind of sets some themes around community safety, this different representation of the police force, and this notion of anonymity, this notion of mask wearing on several ends or several parts of the spectrum, anonymity to enact violence and anonymity to protect oneself. So kind of different usages of what, as a psychologist, I would call de-individuation. So really not being singled out, not being able to be held accountable, not being able to be identified, and even losing a sense of humanity.
Right.
Sometimes when we're, this is a fictional universe, but if we were all wearing masks, I guess we kind of are, but if we were wearing hoods and masks and covering our faces, we might be prone to act out of our typical behavior or even outside of our humanity. I wonder if we will start to see this manifest. Now, we have seen in our experiences over the last few weeks a variety of ways in which communities have expressed feelings of frustration, anger, indifference, rage. And some of those examples are through riots and through destruction of property, destruction of businesses, destruction of the city. And I think a lot of attention is on, I guess, what I would call like the economic impact of this. Like so much focus has been on the economic financial loss.
Yeah.
We haven't really had discussion, I think, as a society around what this kind of demonstration really is. And, we started the show talking about Tulsa.
Mm-hmm.
That unrest, that demonstration of destruction came from feelings, came from some sentiment.
Yeah.
And that was primarily a white community destroying a black community. Mm-hmm. And that's not the only event that it's certainly the most cited historically, but not the only time that's happened.
No.
But I think, again, to have our reactions to that unfold, I think is important.
Yeah. Do we want to go through the rest of the episode where essentially we learn that Angela is still with the police force, though secretly as Sister Knight? She has the cover of being a bakery owner whose bakery has not opened yet and may never. It'll
open in 2 months.
Ish is we're told.
Just give it 2 months.
We're told 2 months. We're told 2 months to a mysterious man played by Louis Gossett Jr., who is in a wheelchair sitting outside the bakery.
He looks to be about 100 years old.
And he might be at least that. If we're playing by the same rules, we can't discuss that. But he does look like an older gentleman who specifically asks her if she thinks he could lift 200 pounds. That's going to become important later. So we learn that she is still with the police force, and we ultimately learn that the 7th Cavalry is planning something big, and they have shot this police officer, potentially killed him. He's in the hospital, and they go looking for someone who can tell them what the plans of the 7th Cavalry are. So they find a person, they interrogate him, actually through this sort of supernatural technology ability. It's Watchmen, so you're going to have that. Tim Blake Nelson plays Wade Tillman. He's known as Looking Glass in the series because he has a mirror-like fabric that he stretches over his face.
It's kind of brilliant.
It is brilliant. And he places someone who he's interrogating inside of a pod. That pod is 360 degrees of video imagery. And it reminds me of one of those psychological tests, actually similar to like the ones you were talking about earlier, where you've constantly got a randomization of imagery, some of them benign, some of them not.
It isn't too dissimilar from what you might see in an implicit bias test.
Yeah.
Or some kind of attention test.
Yeah.
They're looking at the way that this man's eyes are dilating. They're looking at some physiological reactions. They're not so much paying attention to his responses.
Yeah, they don't care.
Yeah.
It's almost like they assume that he is lying. They're really just watching his eyes and determining at what point does it dilate when he sees certain images, and is it consistent?
Right. What did you make of the images? They flash by pretty quickly, but some of them are very visceral.
It could be anything from young children running through a field of flowers to swastikas and the Nazi party. And then you can also see, I think there are images of the KKK. There are images of police officers. There are images of violence. There are images of Rorschach's mask. And things like that. And so every time he sees Rorschach's mask, or every time he sees something from the 7th Cavalry, apparently his eyes dilate.
It's like a recognition test almost.
Yeah. So Looking Glass determines that this guy knows more than he is telling. Mm-hmm. And they track everything down to this little home out on a prairie, and obviously, this is going to be sort of the meeting place for the 7th Cavalry. They are very heavily armed, and it turns into a gunfight between them, the police and the 7th Cavalry members. That all culminates to a a moment where members of the 7th Cavalry are getting onto their own personal airplanes and trying to take off, and that airplane leaves the ground successfully. Meanwhile, Don Johnson, who is playing the police chief, Judd Crawford, is in a vehicle that looks very much like Night Owl's vehicle from the Watchmen series. So presumably the same technology is being used by the police now as was used by Night Owl then. And he invented that, if we remember correctly. And so they shoot the airplane down, but the destruction of the airplane sends that craft down to the ground. And we basically end with everybody celebrating the victory, but also realizing that the person they were trying to get someone alive so that they could learn more information, and they didn't get it.
So you still have this looming potential uprising, this counter group who is who have organized. They've issued videos.
Yeah.
I did appreciate how video and I guess messages were kind of given to us as an audience and also to folks on the show to cue everyone into what's going on. They did have a video to express that there's going to be this big event, and in the video you can see maybe like 40 of these members, so you get the sense that there's more to come.
Yeah. And at the end of the episode, Judd and Angela are having dinner together because we've learned that they are really quite close. He's almost like a father figure to her in some regard. And so their families are having dinner together.
And they're singing Oklahoma, which I have to admit, I've never seen this musical.
Yeah. But
I'm gathering that it is an interesting veneer of harmony and happiness, living on the prairie. Like this musical is identified as this kind of joyous one. Well,
so I did wonder about this a little bit because Oklahoma, for starters, it's really probably most famous because it's the very first Rodgers and Hammerstein collaboration. Obviously, people who know musicals know Rodgers and Hammerstein. But the interesting thing about that play is that it is all about a young girl who is being courted by two people. There's the cowboy, Curly, and then there's I'm looking for the word, farmhand. I just, for the life of me, I could not remember.
There's a cowboy and there's a farmhand.
There's a cowboy and a farmhand. The farmhand's name is Judd. Now, the interesting thing is Don Johnson plays Judd. And so I find myself wondering if this musical, if the parallel is Judd on one side and another character who is going to be pulling the affections of Angela one way or another. Now, Judd isn't necessarily a bad guy, at this point. Like we don't see him. We see him as a good guy.
Well, I think what I was trying, and this is because perhaps I've seen everything, but in displaying such, in displaying the two families, this very powerful man and his wife and their kids, this white family that has clearly a strong relationship with this black family who you have a strong female professional. She's involved in this incredibly important movement. She is working with Judd, he's essentially the sheriff. I mean, what is his his title? So that scene is has elements of collaboration, harmony, this sense of like, we're going to make everything all right. We're the heroes. We're standing for justice. We're bound together for the same liberation. Like, this is where things start to crumble, because it can't quite be. It's almost as if, there's more to this. And the end of the show, the end of the episode, gives kind of a glaring event that we have to reckon with, which is the hanging of this police chief.
Of Judd, yeah. Yeah, the two families part ways. They go home. She gets a call that something has happened. Well, he first gets a call that someone knows something, and Judd climbs into his truck, drives, rolls over a set of spikes on the road, disables his truck. And then the next time we see him, we learn that he has been hanged. So we now have to find out who did it. It's now turned into a murder mystery. And for what reason? What did he know? What was he covering up? What did, we just have to know more about Judd and his background.
I think for a first episode of a Watchmen story in particular, there's a lot packed in there.
Yeah, a crazy amount.
Really sets up a very just a rich landscape. So folks should definitely, again, if you haven't seen the show, it seems like this is a good time. If you have an openness and willingness to be in this alternate universe that really asks you to confront racial tension and racial violence, but in sort of a sideways way, like not exactly mapped onto how we're experiencing it, but with enough similarities that it is provocative. It is subconscious building. It's a lot of I think helpful, curious types of themes that then can get dialogue going, and maybe people will be talking about it. Certainly one of those themes that comes up for me, given that we're seeing examples of partnerships across races, we're seeing folks bound together to uncover, just the first episode, but some of what we're learning is that this isn't really necessary. This isn't a white community that is representing and drifting into white supremacy necessarily. The way that you describe the 7th Cavalry is much like the KKK. Would you agree with that?
Yeah.
And yet we have these potential relationships that give us some, I think, some awareness into some examples of perhaps at least what looks like good allyship or what looks like good activism. And so that's kind of what's on my mind. I know that conversations I've had a lot, and I will say, as a non-Black POC, as a Latinx psychologist, as a person who is a woman of color and works in the psychological field, I will say discussions and dialogue around allyship have been pretty prominent in my work.
Yes.
Especially in the last few weeks. I think that there is a lot of, for a lot of good reasons, there are a lot of questions about allyship in general and what's good allyship, what's bad allyship.
Yeah.
And there are a couple of things I just want to point out, and hopefully folks this could be the starting point, maybe on a journey of finding more information elsewhere, or for a lot of folks, this could be validating their experiences, or perhaps a continuation of some of the things that they're already working on, or a description of their lived experience. First and foremost, this concept of allyship really should be prominent. Yeah. In our relationships, should be discussed, should be checked in on. I think constantly, especially for non-POC folks, are you considering your allyship, and what does that look like? I think it's important to really address the difference between some of some of these representations maybe of what we think allyship is. I think a good way to do that is to talk about the distinction between actors, allies, and accomplices. This might be a simplification, but hopefully for folks, this is a helpful structure or paradigm. An actor, when you think about an actor, this is performative. It's not to say that someone doesn't have good intentions, but the actions of an actor really do not lead to any kind of disruption of the status quo. In many ways, an actor is perpetuating status quo, and they don't necessarily explicitly challenge white supremacy or systems of oppression. And if you're gathering what I'm saying here, I'm meaning that we need to look out for ways in which we are either in a state of indifference or in a state of performance where
when you say performance, though, you're talking about, are you talking about someone who will say, they'll tweet all the right things, but they're not doing anything else?
Yeah. Or, virtue signaling. So here are the places I donated to, or here, and underlying all those tweets and social media posts of Black Lives Matter sentiments, I do want to say that it's not that those aren't genuine necessarily, but what is behind those posts? Is it authentic, and does it relate to actual behavior that manifests in ways that people of color really experience with you? I would rather know that someone, if someone's posting support and recognition, I do like seeing that. It's meaningful to also see what actions and what words behind the scenes, so to speak, take place. So when you think of actor, I want you to think about that's more of a performance, and it matters, but it's pretty insignificant when it comes to actual social change. There's a quote here by Leela Watson that I want to read about shifting away. How do I shift away from being an actor if you're worried about this? And she says, "If you have come here to help me, you're wasting your time. If you have come here because your liberation is bound up with mine, then let's work together." So I truly believe if you trust that if I have freedoms, if I have liberation, that impacts you, that is truly, genuinely something you want, because you want those freedoms for me as well. And you want those freedoms for everybody who you believe have a belongingness in this society. If the motivation is simply because you want to help, or because of your need to make a good impression, or frankly, your worries that you will look racist, that's not helpful. That's not really helping me.
Right.
I think that there's a lot of need for folks to demonstrate that they're not racist.
Yeah.
And we want to move folks, and really I encourage folks to look up Ibram X. Kendi, who talks about this concept of anti-racism. It's not so much to say you're not racist. How are you actualizing your anti-racism sentiments and beliefs? That's really kind of the difference there. Allyship and being an ally is something that I think a lot of people are aware of in general. This is typically where somebody has a greater likelihood to challenge institutionalized racism and white supremacy. So an ally is likely to be a disruptor and to challenge status quo. Someone makes a racist joke, this person speaks up, or someone behaves in a way that devalues somebody in not necessarily in that space, but somebody who is marginalized or disenfranchised. This person addresses it, confronts it.
I realize that we're getting into nuance here, but at what point, how do you know that the person who is disrupting is not also performing in order to look, to look.
Great point.
Like if someone tells a racist joke and then some, Jimmy Joe says, hey, that's not cool. But like, meanwhile, they were doing that because to not say that would have made them look bad. Again, we're getting into nuance. There are levels here, but I don't know that you're necessarily one of these, or maybe you're several of these categories.
And sometimes you might be both. Like sometimes you might actually be performing. I do want to say, like, being an ally is not an invitation to be in black and brown spaces and like gain recognition. Like that's not your time. Step back, right? It's not explaining or overtaking that kind of space.
Right.
And here I'm addressing the white experience clearly. This is a generalization, but in this. I get what you're saying is that you're navigating this, which is, I think, just reflecting on that is a really, really good thing. It's a constant education of oneself, and it's not a sense that you have to do this right now or this week or this month, but that your ongoing experience as a white person is pretty continuous learning and education about what it means to not be white. That's a very overt, intentional thing to do, right? It's asking you to kind of think outside of your perspective. To better answer your question, a lot of us don't know. And so my vigilance is fair. But again, you're not here to earn allyship necessarily. I think the hope is you do the work, I do the work, and we make social change together.
Right.
This is, again,
so whether you were performing or not is irrelevant because you did the work and I'm doing the work and
right.
Together we're going to make the change.
Whatever points you want, this is not about individuals getting these points. And then finally, something that we all want to strive to be is an accomplice. The actions of an accomplice essentially directly challenge institutionalized racism, colonization, and white supremacy by taking actions that block or impede racist people, policy structures. So it's not just calling out the folks who say things once in a while. It is, what are you doing in your behavior to actually challenge and block systemic oppression and racism? Again, going back to this concept, I truly believe, as a non-Black Latinx person, that the liberation of Black Americans directly impacts my liberation. I'm bound to their liberation. I need our white allies to understand that from a perspective of their identities as well.
Right.
That your liberation is my liberation.
Yeah.
Now, clearly, you and I have a personal relationship. So, of course, my liberation and your liberation are completely bound together. And if I may, being in a whiteness space with you, it directly impacts my liberation as a beneficiary.
Yeah.
And
explain that for a second for
if we had another hour, I could go into more depth, but frankly, the ways in which as a person of color, I benefit from your privilege.
Yeah.
Whether it's your last name, whether it's your presence, whether it's
you've said that before.
What we put on paper.
Yeah, you've said that before. Like even being in a restaurant, you are treated differently because I am a white man sitting across from you.
Sure.
Like you are given certain. I'm not going to say given.
And I think this really relates to being an accomplice. That you actually are an accomplice, whether you want to be or not. Yeah. So when I say that you're an accomplice, some of the ways in which people interact with me are very different if I'm with you versus when I'm not with you or I'm alone. Okay. And so you're an accomplice in the sense that you block those interactions. People wouldn't dare to say some of the things that they may say to me if you're not present, or the questions I might get asked if you're not there. And so what's fascinating is that because you're not there, you don't experience it.
Right. I have no idea what you go through when I'm not there.
Sometimes I'll tell you.
Yeah, that's
right. True. But that's kind of the way that, what we want is for an accomplice to be intentional about it. Because certainly you're an accomplice as a as a consequence of our relationship. But we really want this intentional, direct set of actions. Those actions should be informed by, directed, and coordinated with folks who are in Black and brown communities, people of color. So it's not that you're just simply kind of randomly trying to interfere or disrupt the system, but that you're listening to what folks are saying, you're understanding and getting educated around what needs to change when we talk about liberation, when we talk about, let's say, the abolishment of the police, when we talk about certain institutionalized, oppressive systems that need to be eradicated or adjusted. What does that mean? Right. How are you getting educated around that? And of course, what are you doing to build this trust? And so when I think about Judd and when I think about Angela, I'm like, well, he is in a position of power. Is he at this time, before we know anything else about him, he is operating as an accomplice, potentially. Mm-hmm. It's this building of trust and consent and being accountable. And again, just like we talked about with allyship, this is not motivated by personal guilt, by shame, by a sense of like, oh, I've got to overcorrect. I know that builds some anxiety, but I think if the attention is paid on, if the attention is put on taking action and really trying to reckon and to realize that, again, my freedom is bound to your freedom, that could really create some meaningful change. This is hard too, because when things get real, things got real during some of these riots. Things got real during COVID. Mm-hmm. And, are we seeing our allies retreat? Are we seeing them withdraw? Are we seeing them back into indifference? That is really the time that we actually need our accomplices to be present, right? Because we can't really carry everything. So I think going back to what we were saying in terms of what folks are doing that's very visible, the last thing I want to say about this is that genuinely, deeply do some self-reflection, some confrontation. This work of dismantling oppression, this work of dismantling anti-Blackness, of dismantling racism is a long one. Like, this is a long journey. But this work is, I would say, like, this work doesn't need an audience. This work isn't about what's visible necessarily. It's a lot of times what's unseen and what's happening behind the scenes, to kind of use the actor metaphor. I'll put some additional resources in the notes for this episode. Arkham Sessions has put a resource list, essentially, with some literature and some articles about how to work on allyship. What I just described, moving from ally to accomplice, all that language will be on there as well. And as we said in our video recently, we would like to hear from folks. Yeah. What is it that we haven't yet said that you want us to talk about? What are your experiences? What is it from the fictional world that's placing you in moments of reflection and change? And how can we continue this dialogue?
Yeah. If you would like to hear us talk more about the Watchmen, you've got an opportunity to vote over at Patreon right now, going to patreon.com/Arkham Sessions for the next few hours, maybe, depending on when you're listening to this. Our poll is still alive. You've got the opportunity to vote right now. And you can, for only $3, you can get access to vote on what we cover next. Watchmen is certainly one of the series. The other two are the Marvel Cinematic Universe and Steven Universe's first season. And you can go and vote on that at your earliest possible time available, because like I said, this poll's been going for 90 days.
And Watchmen is on the poll, but is
Watchmen
likely,
is on the poll.
okay, at this time, Watchmen is not going to be it. We pretty much know that that's the case.
That's true.
So try to vote for the tiebreaker. If you liked our discussion of Watchmen, maybe we can do more episodes on Patreon. Maybe we can do more episodes in the future, but give us some feedback. Let us know what you think.
Let us know what you think.
Of course, take good care of yourselves and one another, and we'll be here.
Yeah. Drea, why don't you tell people where they can find you online?
You can find me on Twitter at Arkham Asylum Doc and Instagram at Arkham Asylum Doc. For more videos and articles and all sorts of things that I do, you can find me on my website, drdreapsychology.com.
You can find me on Twitter. I am at bward028. You can find me on Instagram at b_ward028. You can find us both on Twitter at Arkham Sessions and on Instagram at the Arkham Sessions. And of course, you can find us on Facebook and again, patreon.com/Arkham Sessions. Till next time, I'm Brian Ward.
I'm Dr. Drea Letamendi.
And together we are
the Arkham Sessions.